Good afternoon. I'm Heather Matthews. I am the chair of the Department of Art and Design here at PLU, and I'm privileged to introduce this next session. So I'm just going to introduce all of the, I have a very sibilant S. I'm just going to introduce all of our speakers together at the beginning and then let them proceed through their presentations. So our first speaker is Judith Cohen, who is the Chief Acquisitions Curator at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. A Harvard University grad, she received her MA from Brandeis and originally came to the Holocaust Museum in 1995 to work on the exhibition Hidden History of the Kovno Ghetto. From there, she moved to the Photo Archives, where she served as director before becoming head of the Curatorial Acquisitions and Reference Branch. Raymond Sun is an associate professor in the Department of History at Washington State University, where he is working to establish a Holocaust and Genocide Studies program. He received his BA in History with high honors from Swarthmore College in 1982, and his PhD in Modern German History from the Johns Hopkins University in 1992. His published scholarship includes work on German Catholicism, German war memory, and teaching about genocide. In 2018, Sun received the WSU Solon Award for Excellence in Instruction for his classes on Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, comparative genocide, and the world wars. Kelly Palmer teaches at the University of Tampa and specializes in the history of modern Europe. A Michigan State University graduate, her research and teaching interests include the history of France, the Holocaust, and European post-war historical memory. Palmer is currently researching American intervention to rescue Jews during World War II through the lens of humanitarian Roswell McClelland, who represented the American Friends Service Committee and War Refugee Board in France and Switzerland. Carla Ullman-Pepperzak, who was born and raised in Amsterdam, was 16 years old in 1940 when the Nazis occupied the Netherlands. She's a Holocaust survivor and persevered for 3.5 years as an active resistance fighter in the Dutch resistance. Over the past 10 years, Pepperzak has dedicated her life to educating people about the Holocaust. A resident of Spokane since 2004, she is an official speaker for the Seattle-based Holocaust Center for Humanity and was honored in 2015 by the state of Washington as a hero in Senate Resolution 8623. Thank you.
So I first want to thank PLU for including me in this really fascinating few days. And I was remarking earlier that it's wonderful how many different fields people are coming here. There are lots of academics. We've seen artists, we've seen filmmakers. And I approach the history a little differently, and that is as a curator. How does that differ? Is that I look at the history very much on the micro level, through the individual collections that we've received. And it's one of the wonderful things about my job, and why I love it so much, is that we get to see new documents, new artifacts that haven't reached the public yet, and teach us new things about the Holocaust that had previously been kept in the privacy of individual families. So when we talk about the Holocaust, we rightfully, first and foremost, think of the 6 million who were murdered, and we think of the victims. Seminars such as this one talk about resistance. But there's one category that we very rarely associate with Jews during the Holocaust, and that is Jews as rescuers. And there are different reasons for this, but one is that the term rescuer is associated with righteous Gentile or righteous among the nations. And in fact, for very good reasons, when Yad Vashem began the program to honor the righteous among the nations, the Tzadikei Umot Ha'olam, it was limited specifically for non-Jews. And that leads to a lot of sort of strange anomalies, that if a rescue operation was coordinated both by Jews and non-Jews, the non-Jewish members of the resistance group would get the honorific, the Jewish members would not. And a number of people, mostly in Israel, some in the United States, wanted to correct this. And several years ago, there was a movement, rather big discussion, actually in the Israeli parliament, in the Knesset, whether the term of righteous should be broadened to include Jews. And looking at it from the outside, I said, of course it should. This is so unfair. Of course you have to include it. But they decided not to for really a good reason. And they said that almost every Jew who survived did so with the help of another Jew. And where do you draw the line? If you share your food with a friend who is starving, does that make you a rescuer? And because everyone was doing something, it just would be too difficult to make this sort of differentiation. But still, there's been more and more attention to the topic of Jews as rescuers, especially by a recent book by Mordechai Paldiel, who actually had for 25 years served as the head of the Righteous program in Yad Vashem, and now he's focusing his attention on Jewish rescuers. So, though the decision to keep the term righteous reserved just for non-Jews, and I think at the end it is the right decision for the reason that I mentioned, one of the problems is that when we look at the history, we sometimes tend to overlook acts of altruism by one Jew and help that they gave to another. With a few examples, tomorrow somebody's going to talk about Bielski, we'll talk about Ozay. There's some well-known Jewish rescuers, but by and large, this has been an untold part of Holocaust history. As I said in the beginning, I study the Holocaust on a micro level, one collection at a time. And recently, we've begun to collect several fascinating, moving collections dealing with the topic of Jewish rescue. For example, a collection of certificates by a Hungarian Jew by the name of George Mandel Montello. He sort of Hispanicized his name, and working in the Salvadoran consulate in Geneva, sent out life-saving Salvadoran citizenship papers. Interesting that the consul who was supporting him is officially a righteous among the nation. We also got a collection from photographs of Luba Trzynska, who unbelievably saved a large number of Dutch Jewish children inside Bergen-Belsen when they were left abandoned in a field, and she brought them into her barrack and saved them within the barrack, a story that almost would be hard to believe if it wasn't for the fact that we have the documentary evidence and the post-war citations and the citations of the people she was helping. So today I want to talk about another story of Jewish rescue, and that is the history of Ben-Sion Kalb, an almost totally unknown name. Okay, who's Ben-Sion Kalb? He was born in Galicia, southern Poland in 1910 in the town of Stryjov, and then he moved to Novi Targ. He spent some time in Krakow in the summer of 1939, where he met and became engaged to Clara Lieber, who was born in 1922. Well, we all know that the summer 1939 was not the best summer to become engaged. In August, they each went to their own hometowns to give their parents the good news with the idea that they would reunite right afterwards. Of course, September 1st, Germany invades Poland, and the two become separated because Stryjov is under German occupation. Stryj, where Clara was under Soviet occupation. Now, shortly after the German invasion, Kalb got into an altercation with a German policeman, which ended up being a stroke of luck. You don't think of it as a stroke of luck, but what happened is the guy started slapping him around, and at the time the border was open, he said, "I'm out of here," and was able to get across. And he crossed the border into Slovakia. And to see what comes next, we have to look at Slovakia's unique geographic location. it is halfway between Poland and Hungary. And this is going to play an important role later on. And it's surrounded from southern Poland with the Tatra Mountains, which are fairly steep, wooded mountains. After crossing into Slovakia, Kalb met the rabbi, whose name that may be familiar to a lot of you, Rabbi Michael Dov Weissmandl, who was forming a resistance group called the Working Group. And the Working Group is an amazing example when people put political differences aside to work together. Rabbi Weissmandl, an ultra-Orthodox rabbi, the son-in-law of the head of the famous Nitra Yeshiva, and he's working together with his cousin, Gizi Fleischman, who's a secular Zionist. Third member of the working group was Armin Fritter, Rabbi Armin Fritter, a reform or neolog rabbi, and other people. And yet they all came together to say, what can they do to try to save Slovak Jewry? Now, at first, Slovakia seems like an odd place to launch a rescue effort. Slovakia was an ally of Nazi Germany. It was headed by a fascist leader, President Tiso, and it was the first Nazi ally to decide to deport its Jewish population to Auschwitz. And in 1942, some of the very first deportations to Auschwitz came from Slovakia, and about 2/3 of the country's Jewish population was deported then. But then something odd happened. The deportations stopped. Why did this happen? Well, there were a couple things going on. The Papal Nuncio in Bratislava passed on reports that German authorities were murdering Slovak Jews, and they started lobbying to stop the deportations. However, also, Weissmandl began bribing the local head of the SS, Captain Vyslečený. Vyslečený was corrupt and happy to be bribed. It helps. He believed in Nazi propaganda that American Jews were all powerful, so Weissmandl created a false name for himself, Ferdinand Roth. He said Roth was supposedly a wealthy American Jew working out of Switzerland, and Weissmandl managed to collect $50,000 from Jews in Slovakia and also in Hungary. Now, historians still debate why the deportation stopped. Was it more because of the Papal Nuncio, or was it more because of what Weissmandl was doing? We don't know. But what we do know is that for a 2-year hiatus, from 1942 to 1944, Slovakia was a relatively safe place. The term relatively was still anti-Semitic, Jews were still persecuted, but a relatively safe place, especially when compared to neighboring Poland. Rabbi Weissmandl actually wanted to do much more than just save Slovak Jews. He continued to negotiate with Vyslečený and had said that he could raise $2 to $3 million from Jews in neutral countries to stop deportations entirely. Well, he wasn't able to raise that much money. Jews in neutral countries were not thrilled at the idea of giving money to go into the Nazi war coffers. And it's very unlikely that the higher-ups, that Himmler would have agreed to this anyhow. So it went nowhere, but I think it's interesting is that it shows how Weissmandl was going to do whatever was in his power to try to rescue people. Okay, let's go back to the story of Kalb. What's he doing this time? Well, he's helping Weissmandl in a small way, doing small things for him. And he's also desperately looking for ways to bring his fiancée, Clara, into Slovakia. Meanwhile, 1941, Eastern Poland, as we all know, was occupied by the Germans. And she, over the next year or two, goes to a series of ghettos. She witnessed the execution of close friends, so relatives die. She herself was arrested, miraculously escaped. And then in 1943, Kalb finally makes contact with her, sends her a letter that she receives in Bochnia, a small town near the Slovak border. And Kalb tells her that he's paid a smuggler to bring her across. She's taken, she meets a courier who was working for Kalb by the name of Jan Melek. They hide her overnight in a pigsty, and they bring her across the Tatra Mountains to Slovakia. There, they reunite. Rabbi Weissmandel performs the marriage, all happy news. But Clara also, at this point, tells Rabbi Weissmandel what's going on in Poland. And one young man has succeeded in escaping from Treblinka and returning to the Bochnia ghetto. And she's able to report this back to Rabbi Weissmandel. And he got very contemporary, serious information about what was happening on the other side of the border. And Rabbi Weissmandel and Kalb realized that the same way that Kalb was able to bring Clara over the border, they can bring other Jews over. And Rabbi Weissmandel is raising funds. Kalb is doing all the logistics with smugglers in order to bring things out. And then once they came from Poland to Slovakia, they then figured ways to get them either to Romania or to Hungary, which was still independent. And some of them went on to Palestine. And this was called the Tiul, the trip, this underground railroad out of Poland. And this letter here is one that is part of the collection, and it's very easy to break code, I could say. It's Hebrew in Roman letters. And it says, and it's a note from Rabbi Weissmandel to Benzion Kalb. What can I say? What can I tell? We're facing destruction. We should all say we're to be blamed because there was a time when we could rescue many more if we had the funds. My heart and body are broken in fragments, and now I plead with you, do whatever is possible to rescue what's left. Maybe you still have some means left. In the time of fury, we think all will be lost, but later it appears there are a few who are still in hiding and can be rescued. Actually, that was a different letter, and this letter says, the courier of this letter received $150,000 from Mrs. G and others, Gizi Fleischman, for the purpose of bringing out refugees. Together with this amount, you'll receive $20,000 from Moshe D., Michael Dov Weissmandel. For refugees, this is November 1943. The first priority was to save children, especially orphans. This beautiful studio portrait is actually of Benzion Kalb and two of the boys that they smuggled over the border. It was taken in Bratislava, in a photo studio in Bratislava in 1943. They're the Weinberg brothers, Alter and Yitzhak. And Kalb writes a letter talking about the difficulties these boys experienced. They were both orphans at this point. And he says, today, 7 children arrived. Your heart breaks looking at how these children without coat or shoes came from the depths of hell. Children from our most respected families, now without mother or father, orphans, remnants of the tens and tens of thousands of pure children whose blood was spilled on the water on the altar of God and our faith. Here's a letter that he wrote. Here are the children. Here are the Landau children who also came in the same time. And a letter from the Jewish Agency for Palestine attests that during one 3-week period in 1943, Kalb rescued 102 young children under the age of 10 from the Polish ghettos and was able to get them to Palestine, including these siblings here. Okay, how do we know this? Prove it. And this is one of the wonderful things about this collection, is that it includes typed and handwritten notes of people who were rescued, their ages, their addresses, and we've been able to work backwards. There are even some thank you notes that were written from Hungary in 1943, 1944, and sent back to Kalb, thanking him for it. Many of the people who were rescued were Hasidic Jews. And a post-war letter from the Bobover Chassid wrote, he said, "With my heart and soul, I want to fulfill my obligation to you for your work in the days of rage and destruction, to testify and inform mankind of your heroism, an honor to have served as a messenger who, from the death to life, many hundreds of Jewish souls. And according to the rumors I've heard, you saved thousands of men, women, and children, among them orphans, widows, from the clutches of the accursed Nazis by taking them from Poland by way of Slovakia to Hungary. You found the route and the connections across the border, and you sent non-Jewish messengers across the border, and several times you yourself crossed the border to save children, and the wicked ran after you. And I know of your rescue work because my brothers and I and many of our family members were saved by this route that you opened up." So many, many Hasidic Jews, but not only Hasidic Jews. Like the working group, it was a mixture of people from all walks of life. This photo, which I pulled out of Wikipedia, is of Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a nuclear physicist and one of Marie Curie's students. He is on the list. And here's a face that is familiar to, I'm sure, lots and lots of you, Antik Zuckerman, one of the heroes of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He did not cross the border, but he sent this letter, and you can see it's dated January 6th, 1944. And he writes, "Dear friends, we received your letter and thank you. We're moved by your concern about our survival. To our sorrow, despite our slaughter, we will not come to you. I'm busy here with matters of rescue and defense and lives of thousands of Jews." In other words, he's doing his own rescue work in Poland, and he said he's not going to just cross the border and abandon what he's doing. "I thank you from the bottom of my heart to you and the rest of your friends there. Perhaps the day will still come when we'll see you. Who knows? We'll try for Tzivia to come to you." And then he goes on in a very serious vein. "It appears all the Jews who went to Oswiecim, in other words, Auschwitz, were killed. Remember, in your work hangs the fate of the remainder of Israel in the land of Poland. Do whatever you can to help us. If it's possible, notify Israel on our behalf. We're working on behalf of the surviving remnant." So how many people were saved by this rescue operation? The fact of the matter is we don't know. Our database lists about 200 individuals, but it's by no means complete. After the war, Benzion first went across the border, came west. Clara followed behind. He asked her to bring the archive with her. By then, the communists had already taken over Czechoslovakia. She thought it would be suspicious to walk off with the full archive, so she just took certain documents and left most of the papers behind. So we don't have the full numbers. According to Clara, her husband saved at least 200 children. The Bobover Rebbe talks about 1,000. The post-war memorial book, the Isker book for Stryjov, says that he saved 3,000. So ever since receiving this collection, I've been trying to do more research and figure out who else might have been saved. And it's not always easy because people change their name. A lot of people have subsequently passed away. Many of the people who got to Hungary, like Werdenstein, then died. He died in the bombing of Budapest. So it's not always easy. Some people were easier to find, others were harder. So here's a man, Stanley Ronell, who was born Stanislav Rothblum. His name is not on the list. But when going through the list of names, I found a reference in his oral testimony, a Shoah Foundation testimony, to his aunt and cousin, Frida and Victor Zilbering. Their names are on the list. And when you listened to him, he said that the four of them crossed the border together. So I was able to add two more. This woman, Brant Fixler, actually is the only Shoah Foundation testimony I found where she talks about having crossed the border and mentions Kalb by name, but she also mentions that she crossed the border with these extended family. So we were able to add those names as possible. Then, what's the coda? Kalb's rescue efforts only lasted about 6 months, and it ended in early 1944. In March 1944, the Holocaust arrived in Hungary with the full brunt following the German invasion. So Hungary is no longer a safe zone. It's now front and center for the Holocaust. And then in late August, partisans in Slovakia rise up, there's a rebellion, and the Germans reciprocate by rounding up remaining Jews and sending them to Auschwitz. About half of the remaining Jewish population, and that was a third of what had been pre-war, were deported to Auschwitz. Benzion and Clara Kalb survived the war in a bunker. Rabbi Weissmandl, his wife and children were on a deportation train to Auschwitz. Rabbi Weissmandl jumped off. He survived. His wife and children were killed. Gizzy Fleischman, who had worked tirelessly to raise funds for this rescue effort, was among those arrested in 1944 and murdered in Auschwitz. I want to end with it's just some other children who survived. I want to end with a small coda. I was talking about this in a senior facility outside of Washington, Leisure World, and there was a woman in the audience sitting towards the front, and she's getting more and more shaken, and she's in tears, and I could see she was physically shaken from the presentation. And then she raised her hand, and I called on her first. And she said to me, "It's as if you were telling my story." She said, "I was born in Krakow. I was liberated in Hungary." She was only about 4 or 5 years old. She said, "But I have no memory how I got to point A to point B." She has no idea how she got to Hungary. So I said, "Let's meet tomorrow." And we had breakfast together. And I looked at the list of names. Her name was not on the list. But her older cousin, who's sitting on the end there, she's the young girl in the middle. That's a picture taken in DP camp, unfortunately got a little cut off. Her name was on the list. And it became clear that the whole family, and she had crossed with her older cousin, that they were all saved thanks to this rescue effort. So I'm going to throw out a request that if you know anybody who survived either in Slovakia or Hungary, but was born and spent the majority of the war in Poland, let me know so we can see if they were also part of this remarkable rescue effort. So as I said, there's no official honorific for, oh, and here she is. I'm sorry, I forgot this slide. She's now the shorter woman, and the tall man is the son of Benzion Kalb. And here she is looking at the document that saved her life. They came and visited the Holocaust Museum. So there's no official honorific for Jews who rescue other Jews. But recently, the B'nai B'rith organization is trying to undo this, and there's now an award through B'nai B'rith for Jewish rescuers. And in 2017, Benzion Kalb posthumously received this honor, and there's the same son that you saw before, Mark, receiving the honor for his father. Thank you very much.